Hello and welcome to Frost Over the World in yet another momentous week for the world's financial system. Later in the programme, former US National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski on America's place in the world and much more besides. And then the one and only Shane Warne, the Australian spin-bowling wizard and/or marvel. And the Foreign Minister of Colombia as well. But this week, the focus has been particularly in terms of the world economic crisis on, of all places, Britain. So that's why we begin with David Cameron, the UK leader of the opposition and Prime Minister in waiting. This week's collapse in the financial markets, this latest one, has had an immediate effect on Prime Minister Gordon Brown. He took decisive action to part nationalise the ailing banks and finding $500 billion to put into the system. And that's in pounds, not yen. So when on Thursday I met David Cameron at the House of Commons, I began by asking him on a scale of 1 to 10, how worried was he?
I think it's difficult to put a number on it, but I think it was a very worrying situation because there is still a real problem with the banking sector, not just in Britain, but around the world. And in a free enterprise economy, banks play an incredibly important role of lending money to businesses, to individuals, to farmers, to everybody. And if the banking system collapses, you can have a real economic downturn, a really deep economic downturn. So you can't allow that to happen. And that's why I think it was right to intervene and to take steps to shore up the strength of the banking system. Because we know from history, in 1929, it wasn't the stock market crash that led to the Great Depression. It was the banking crisis and the failure to deal with that. And so we were staring down the barrel of a very big gun.
And who do you blame? I mean, was one group of people who were more to blame than anyone else for what's happened?
I think you have to look at a sort of deep explanation of what had been happening. There's the combination of the very toxic debt from subprime mortgages in the US that had infected the whole financial system. But at the same time, there's also very high levels of indebtedness, very high levels of leverage, including in my own country, the UK, where I think we borrowed too much and for too long. I think that we had a debt-fueled boom that had got, frankly, quite out of control. So that's one of the reasons why I think the UK has been particularly affected. And there are lessons there for bankers, there are lessons for regulators, and there are lessons for politicians.
So far in this period, do you think, looking back, there was too little regulation or too much?
It was the wrong sort of regulation. I think it's not necessarily just the quantity, although that can be important. I think in the case of the United Kingdom, I think that a very big mistake that was made is that the Bank of England used to have a role, had a role for decades in history, of calling time on debt levels in the economy as a whole. That role was ended in 1997. So if you like, the rules were changed, but the referee was taken off the pitch. There was no one to call time on debt levels. I think that was a mistake, because this isn't just about the actual rules you have, it's about the strength of the institutions. And to me, the Bank of England is a historically strong institution, a respected institution, and it needs to be restored to that place in the financial regulatory system.
Would you like it to be back under government control?
Not back under government control. I think it's good the Bank of England is independent for the purpose of setting interest rates and monetary policy. That works. I know, I've seen it, how badly things can be if you have politicians setting interest rates. So I think it's right that it's independent for that purpose, but it's also got another role, which is overseeing debt levels in the economy. The government took that away from it, and that was a mistake.
And in fact, you may well have to review all of your policies, really, if there's less money available. I mean, suddenly maybe you won't be able to afford some subsidies, you may not be able to afford lots of new houses or whatever. It could change your plans as well.
Well, we have always been very cautious about announcing public spending plans or tax plans because we've known that the government already has a very big deficit. If you look at the government itself for a minute, in Britain we've had 14 years of economic growth, yet at the end of that growth we got a budget deficit. Now that is an indictment of our government. That is wrong. We should have used the good years to put aside money. We should have a budget surplus in Britain at the end of 14 years growth like other countries have. The fact we haven't shows that the government has not got it right.
And this was really the biggest financial challenge yet for the European Union. How do you think they've performed?
Well, I think it's been regrettable that different European countries have done different things at different times. The issue of different European countries announcing they're going to guarantee bank deposits, for example, I think that hasn't been helpful. And I think this is not a question of needing stronger European institutions. We keep strengthening European institutions. The problem is actually a lack of political will. The political will to try to do things together, to work together, that needs to be there. And let's hope that after what's happened in Britain, there will now be more cooperation between the European countries on this.
In terms of Europe, David, we've got a situation at the moment where obviously Britain signed on for the Lisbon Treaty, although that's dormant at the moment. If and when you come to power, and if it hasn't been absolutely finalised, still in a dormant state, would you retract Britain's signature?
Well, we would hold the referendum that the Labour government promised, that we promised, that every party at the last election promised. We would hold that referendum. I would recommend a no vote, because I think this is the wrong treaty for Europe. I don't think we need to pass more powers from the nation states to the European Union. We'd hold that referendum, recommend a no vote, and I hope that would kill off the treaty altogether. The Irish voted no, but the powers that be in Europe seem determined to bully the Irish into having another referendum and saying, yes, I'd like that referendum and I'd recommend a no vote.
Right. And you'd obviously, presumably, if there was negotiated as it were, Lisbon or somewhere else, Lisbon II, a new treaty, that you'd also put to a referendum.
Well, yes, we've said that, and I think this is right, that any treaty that involves the passage of power from your nation state to the European Union, any treaty like that, should automatically have a referendum. I think there's an important principle here that politicians are elected, yes, to make laws, yes, to make decisions, yes, to make judgments. We're not elected to give up the powers that are vested in us without asking the people first. So I think there's a very simple principle. If you're giving up powers, you've got to turn around and ask the people first.
What about Russia, Georgia? When Russia invaded Georgia, was the West's reaction to that satisfactory?
I don't think it was either before or afterwards. No. I think in terms of before, I think it was the NATO summit in Bucharest that was rather flimsy about whether or not Ukraine and Georgia would in time be able to join NATO. I think if a firmer statement was made about the fact that if democracies want to join NATO and can qualify, they can. A firmer statement, I think, would have sent a clearer message to the Russians. I think the Russians sensed a bit of weakness and division. In terms of after the invasion had taken place, many political leaders and party leaders, myself included, actually went to Georgia and said, look, we're going to stand side by side with you at a time when your democracy is threatened. But I think that more could have been done in the EU and elsewhere more quickly to make that absolutely clear, and not to try and, I think some people sort of slightly went for the idea that there was some sort of moral equivalence between what Georgia had done in South Ossetia, where there is a territorial dispute, but everyone accepts that South Ossetia is part of Georgia's historic boundaries, that people tried to draw a moral equivalence between that and Russia's invasion of Georgia and the fact that troops stayed there, you know, for days and weeks afterwards. There's no moral equivalence. What Russia did was wrong. They invaded a sovereign country. They invaded a country whose own borders they had previously recognized, and that is against international law. And I think it needed to be said very clearly, very quickly, and not everybody got that right.
Right, but at the same time, a Russian would also point out that this was really right on the edge of Russia. It was like Cuba to America. It was right on the edge, and that we have been provoking Russia.
I don't really buy this argument that the West has been incredibly unfair to Russia. When the Soviet Union fell apart, there's been huge amounts done, including Russia in the G8, opening up trade, holding talks. There's been a lot done, I believe, to try and say to Russia, look, if you behave according to good and democratic norms, you can be part of all these organizations, all of these institutions, that you will be welcome to work alongside others at the absolutely top table. And I think that offer has always been there, and it's still there. But what you can't have is a situation where Russia behaves as she sometimes does, you know, murdering Litvinenko on the streets of London, as it were, invading countries like Georgia, behaving in an extraordinary way in economic terms, and then think that actually the rest of the world should just say, well, we accept that. We shouldn't.
Do you think Lugavoy will ever be tried in London for the Litvinenko murder?
Well, I would hope so, but obviously we're making very, very slow progress.
Very, very little progress indeed, yes. In terms, you've just recently, last month, been in Afghanistan and other places. But basically, your policies in Afghanistan and on Israel, Palestine, and on Iraq are very close to those of the present government, aren't they?
Yeah, they are quite close. I think particularly in politics, you shouldn't try and make difference with your opponents artificially. You should work out what you think the right thing to do is, and if you agree with the government, say, good, let's work together. That's the way I approach politics. In Afghanistan, we support what our troops are doing. Let's be clear, they're there because if the Taliban come back, the terrorist training camps will come back, and if the terrorist training camps come back, there'll be more terrorists and more bombs and more slaughter on the streets of London. It's as simple as that. I do think, though, there are some changes that need to be made. I want to see a much greater emphasis on political progress. We've got to persuade the Afghan government to cut out the corruption, to cut out the drug trade that still goes on, members of the government possibly themselves involved. You know, these are real. If we don't deal with the politics, there's a danger, as I've put it, we could, you know, win the war but lose the country, and we mustn't let that happen.
Talking of that, your Foreign Secretary said, Shadow Foreign Secretary, said that we have to win the war in Afghanistan. And our head of military out there then said 2 or 3 days later, not particularly indirect, but happened to say that we will never win the war. Well, we can't have both of those, obviously.
I looked at what Brigadier Mark Carlton-Smith, the commander of our forces there, I looked at what he said, and it seemed to me what he was actually saying is, look, there will not be one decisive military encounter which will win the war. And to that extent, he's right in that we're fighting a counterinsurgency, and all the lessons of history going back over many, many years are that you never win a counterinsurgency through military means alone. There has to be political progress, and we need to make sure that political progress happens. We've got to offer people in Afghanistan the stability and security and the sense that progress can take place, and if we can offer them that, the Taliban will be defeated.
Can you ever foresee a situation in which we, British forces, British troops, would support Israel in a nuclear attack on Iran?
I think the whole issue with Iran is that we want to keep up the pressure so that they recognise that acquiring nuclear weapons is the wrong way forward for that country. As William Hague has put it, that it would be a calamity to attack Iran, but it would be calamitous if they acquired nuclear weapons. So I don't believe in taking options off the table. We should keep the pressure up. What we've said very clearly is we need both stick and carrot, and perhaps America needs to demonstrate a bit more carrot and Europe should demonstrate a bit more stick. And I think in that way, actually, we could say to the Iranians, again, it's a similar conversation. Look, Iran has a great history as a nation and a people. You have every chance of joining the international community of nations, of having relations with European countries and with America over time, but you have to pursue a path which is about peace and not acquiring nuclear weapons. And I think there's a perfectly reasonable approach to make.
But if there was a military clash between Israel and Iran, could we be involved? Would we be involved? I mean, if Iran attacked first.
Well, it's not a set of circumstances I want to speculate about, but I think that our approach is clear. We shouldn't take off the table. Some politicians in the West have said, look, we should just rule out in any way that there could ever be any justification for any form of military action. I don't think it's right to take things off the table. No one wants that to happen, but we need to keep up the pressure on Iran and say, look, there is a peaceful path here, which is give up the ambition to have nuclear weapons. Perfectly possible to have civil nuclear power, as other countries do, without having the capacity for nuclear weapons. And it's perfectly possible to have good, open, friendly trading relations with other countries. But there are some issues that have to be addressed. Not most important of all is the nuclear one.
Would you like to see more pressure from the United States on Israel and so on to come more to the table with the Palestinians?
I think that everyone wants to see the two-state deal. My view is that we have to be quite robust with both sides. We need to say to Hamas, look, you have to recognize the state of Israel. You can't expect them to talk to you if you're not even accepting their right to exist. You've got to accept peaceful means and an end to violence. You've got to respect previous agreements. But we should also talk quite robustly with the Israelis and say, you know, the building of settlements has got to stop, that a land for peace deal means exactly that, and you have to understand the sense that Palestinians feel that they are being built out of their own land, and that has got to stop.
Well, this has been the most enjoyable tour of the world we've been having, going from the sublime to the ridiculous at the end of this conversation. Several people have said to me, no, we're going to have this conversation, do ask David if he is going to, his first government will bring back or enable the bringing back of fox hunting.
I think we should have another vote in the House of Commons on a free vote basis and ask people if they want to change the law. And if they do, I would be happy to change the law. I voted against the ban on fox hunting. I think it was one of those things, it was an area into which the criminal law shouldn't have gone. It was criminalising something that had taken place for a very long time in our country. The law looks a bit of a mess. It's being made a bit of a mockery of, and I think it'd be better if it wasn't there. But Parliament will have to decide.
Yes, but you'd make time for that.
We would have a vote, and if Parliament decided to get rid of the law, I would make that happen.
Very good. Well, we've been all over the world, including fox hunting. Thank you very much indeed, David. It's been a real delight as ever.
Pleasure.
The Foreign Minister of Colombia, that tumultuous country, joins me in a moment. That's after this short break.